To pawn something means to use it as collateral when you borrow money. Typically, the pawned item is held by the lender, returned to the borrower if they pay back what they borrowed plus interest. You pawn things because you need cash right away, and experts say the things that are most commonly pawned are jewelry, electronics, sports equipment, musical instruments, and power tools. But fans of the show Pawn Stars know that sometimes much larger things are brought into pawn shops. Pawning things isn't exactly new. In 1388, King Edward III pawned the crown jewels of England to the House of Lombard in order to finance a war with France. One of the most astounding, if not the largest in terms of economic value, items to have been pawned in history is the northernmost constituency of the United Kingdom. Two archipelagos consisting of nearly 180 islands and 1,000 square miles of land. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The website Historic UK explains the relationship of the Orkney and Shetland Islands to the rest of the United Kingdom. To many people on the UK mainland and beyond, the Shetland and Orkney Islands are somewhere up at the top of the map of Great Britain. Together, two sets of islands are referred to as the Northern Isles. The Orkney Islands are some 6 miles from the Scottish mainland. The archipelago has an area of some 380 square miles, over 70 islands, the largest being mainland. Shetland lies from 100 nautical miles north of Orkney in the North Sea, almost equidistant from Norway as they are from Aberdeen. The archipelago includes around 100 islands, covering 566 square miles, with, confusionally, the largest island also being called mainland. Today, the combined populations of Orkney and Shetland is about 45,000. But the two archipelagos set themselves apart from the rest of Scotland by more than just 2 ocean straits, Historic UK explains. Both Orkney and Shetland are unique and unlike any other part of Great Britain. They have managed to retain many of their original, unique customs and traditions resulting from their long and eventful history. The website Shetland.org explains that the differences between Shetland and the rest of Scotland can be quite striking. And the travel website Rick Steves Europe explains that, with no real tradition for clans or tartans, Orkney feels not Highlander or even Scottish, but uniquely Orcadian. The difference lies in prehistory. Most sets of islands have significant settlements in prehistory. According to the Shetland Amenity Trust, evidence of farming settlements in Shetland appear around 5,000 years ago. And the heritage site Britain Express writes that we don't know for certain when the first humans settled in Orkney, but archaeological evidence shows that there were settlements in the islands by about 3900 BC. These first settlers were hunter-gatherers. A 1934 article in the journal Nature describes the early settlers of Shetland. The prehistoric inhabitants were a simple pastoral people of Stone Age culture whose pottery suggests the Iron rather than the Bronze Age. In fact, prehistoric ruins are some of the major attractions for tourists visiting the islands today. As there was limited timber for building, prehistoric peoples in the Northern Isles used stone, allowing extraordinary preservation. The Shetland Amenity Trust explains that due to the lack of mature trees, rocks have been used as a building material in Shetland since the earliest times. This has resulted in some of the best preserved archaeology in Europe and examples of stonemasons' art. Britain Express writes that these Neolithic settlers of Orkney left an indelible mark on the landscape, primarily through chambered tombs, standing stones, and stone circles. While archaeologists say that it is unclear exactly what people initially colonized the Northern Isles, their unique geography was helping to define their unique culture from the start. Encyclopedia.com explains that far from the earliest settlements by Neolithic agriculturalists in the 4th millennium BC, the Northern Isles of Scotland, as Orkney and Shetland are known collectively, served as the northwestern frontier of the Eurasian landmass, and westward movements of people, ideas, and domestic plants and animals stopped there. Nature notes that during the Iron Age, simple, unornamented pots began to be replaced by pots with the deep, hollowed rim characteristic of the continental Hallstatt people. The islands were likely broadly engaged in trade, and Britain Express notes that the inhabitants are known to have used Latin and Old Gaelic. The Romans were well aware of the islands, though they made no attempt to conquer them, and there's some suggestion that they traded with the inhabitants. Archaeology suggests the islands had periods when they were settled by Gaels, and then they were part of a Pictish kingdom. But what most defines the cultural difference today is that at some point both sets of islands were settled, perhaps conquered, by Norsemen. Exactly when this occurred is not clear, but the heritage site Orkney Jarl supposes that the first Viking raids in Britain are recorded in the 780s, by which time it seems likely that the Norse already had a foothold in Orkney. The island's strategic position off the northern coast of Scotland and at the center of the Viking sea raids made them the obvious choice as a base for further expansion and raids into Scotland and Ireland. And Encyclopedia.com writes that Shetland is a part of Britain which is geographically closest to Norway. As such, it was a logical first landfall for Norwegian Vikings who sailed south to British and Irish locations. Thus, Shetland and nearby Orkney were likely staging points for Viking raids in the 9th and 10th centuries AD, when these attacks were most frequent. Orkney Jarl suggests the motive for the new immigration to the Northern Isles might have been driven by a population boom in Norway, leading people to emigrate in search of farmland, although the islands would also have been attractive because Orkney provided the perfect base for raiding, plunder, and conquest in Scotland and the coastlines of Britain. Still, Orkney Jarl notes, very little is actually known about the early days of Viking Orkney. The circumstances surrounding the first Norse arrivals and the eventual takeover of Orkney remains hotly debated to this day. When did the first settlers arrive? Did they integrate with the indigenous Orcadians? The 15th century Latin work called Historia Norwegiae suggests that the islands were conquered. In the days of Harald Fairhair, king of Norway, certain pirates of the family of the most vigorous Prince Ronald set out with a great fleet and crossed the Salundic Sea and stripped those races of their ancient settlements, destroyed them wholly, and subdued the islands to themselves. But Orkney Jarl notes that the work was written hundreds of years after these events were supposed to have occurred and can only be treated as a reflection of the beliefs of the time it was written. In fact, Orkney Jarl writes, settlement likely started before the time of Harald Fairhair, and although we know the Norwegian settlement of Orkney probably began in earnest in the 8th century AD, it is not known whether the Vikings came as land takers, dispossessing the indigenous Orcadians, or whether they were farmers and traders who settled peacefully. And while the exact nature and timing of the original Norse settlement in the Northern Isles is not clear, the effect of Norse settlement is obvious. While the original name for Orkney may have been derived from Latin or Pictish languages, the name was at least co-opted by Norse settlement, as Orkney means in Old Norse, Seal Islands. Similarly, the name Shetland is also likely derived from Old Norse, meaning hilt land. Shetland.org writes that the names of places, geographical features, birds, and parts of boats have Scandinavian roots, as do many personal names. The Shetland dialect is infused with words that have their origins in Old Norse, a language with strong similarities to Faroese and Icelandic. While the exact nature of the initial settlement is unclear, Orkney Jarl notes that by the end of the 13th century, the fact that Orkney was a part of Norway and fell under Norwegian jurisdiction is without question. The island's culture, language, and way of life were entirely that of a Norse earldom. The official takeover of the islands has also been attributed to King Harald Fairhair. Britain Express writes that the Vikings saw the Orkneys as an ideal base for their swashbuckling expeditions around the North Sea, but they made too many raids against their homeland, and the Norse leader Harald Fairhair defeated them and took over both Orkney and Shetland in 875. That is, Viking pirates raided not only England, but Norse shipping, compelling the king to mount an expedition to take over the islands. Because don't all good stories involve pirates? However, this account is derived from a 12th century Icelandic saga called the Orkney Inga saga, and some modern scholars have come to question the accuracy of the narrative, and even the historical existence of Harald Fairhair. In any case, however, Britain Express notes that the islands were ruled by a succession of Norwegian jarls, or earls, until 1231. It is estimated that nearly one-third of current Orcadians are descended from Norse stock. But by then the fate of Orkney and Shetland had become tied to another set of British Isles. The Hebrides are a large archipelago off the western coast of Scotland between Great Britain and Ireland. Their history is similar to the Northern Isles, having been settled in prehistory and then eventually conquered as part of the Norse kingdom. Much like the Northern Isles, the exact details of the North conquest are unclear, with Irish historian Donach O'Corran writing in 1998 book Vikings in Ireland and Scotland in the 9th century, that when and how the Vikings conquered and occupied the Isles is unknown, perhaps unknowable. The Orkney Inga saga asserts that the Hebrides were conquered by Sigurd the Stout, the Earl of Orkney. The Norse name for the islands was Sureyjar, meaning Southern Islands, to distinguish them from the Northern Isles of Orkney and Shetland. By the middle 9th century, the Hebrides, along with the island of Clyde and the Isle of Man, were a semi-independent Norse kingdom called the Kingdom of the Isles. There were various conflicts between Norse lords, and at times the kingdom was separated, but there was also conflict with the kings of Scotland over possession of the islands. In 1098, King Magnus III, also known as Magnus Barefoot of Norway, invaded the islands, and King Edgar of Scotland, eager to settle disputes and consolidate his power, officially ceded the islands to Norway. By the 13th century, Scotland was known as the Kingdom of Alba, and its ambitious king, Alexander II, had designs on the Hebrides. First, he attempted to purchase the islands from King of Norway, Haakon IV, although Haakon declined. Alexander II died, but his son Alexander III continued to pursue Scottish control over the Western Islands, prompting Haakon to invade to defend the Kingdom of the Isles. Alexander III defeated Haakon IV in the October 1263 Battle of Largs. The conflict may have continued, but Haakon died in Orkney in December. His son, Magnus Haakonsson, decided to cede the islands to the Scots in the July 1266 Treaty of Perth, in exchange for a large sum of 4,000 marks, plus an annuity of 100 marks. The treaty also confirmed Norwegian rule of Orkney and Shetland, although ironically it was the terms of the treaty that would eventually undermine that rule. 2 centuries later, European politics were much changed. In his 1995 work, Orkney Stories, historian David Roth explains, Europe in the late 15th century was a continent in growing ferment. Across its jigsaw pattern of kingdoms, there was a sense of restlessness and impatience. The Scandinavian kingdoms, including Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, as well as the Northern Isles, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland, had been combined into the Kalmar Union, but the union had begun to disintegrate after the death of King Christopher of Bavaria in 1448. His successor, Christian I of Denmark, had difficulty maintaining the union. He was, in short, impoverished, and he had an ongoing conflict with Scotland over the annuity that had been promised in the Treaty of Perth. Roth continues, between Scotland and Denmark there was an unfinished business from that increasingly remote past. For more than 300 years, ever since the Viking invasions, the Western and the Northern Isles had been fiefs of the Norwegian king. The Western Isles had been won back by a mixture of warfare and cash, but Scotland was still bound to pay Norway an annual rental. This was a modest sum, but the attached penalties for non-payment were much greater. Scotland had not paid for decades, and now owed the Kingdom of Norway 500,000 marks. It was a colossal amount, and Christian, despite his wide realms, was chronically short of money. If the Scottish debt were to be paid off, his fortunes would be transformed. Christian attempted to press the debt with King James II, but James's untimely death, the topic of another episode of the History Guide, put the issue off. In 1468, Christian pursued the issue again, but by then his situation was much changed. Sweden had chosen and won independence in a rebellion in 1464. Christian was deeply in debt and realized there was little chance of recovering the money owed by Scotland. The young King James III was ambitious, and Christian apparently decided that an alliance with Scotland might help him to gain allies on the continent. The newspaper The Guardian explains, to get round the problem, it was decided that the offspring of the two kings should marry. Margaret would wed James III of Scotland, and her dowry would be 60,000 Rheingilden, golden florins of the Rhineland. Ross writes that, in addition to that, the payments to Norway were annulled forever, and the vast accumulated debt completely written off. James and Margaret were married in 1469. But the agreement left a problem, as Christian did not have the 60,000 florins for the dowry. He made an initial payment of 2,000 florins and pawned the Orkney Islands to Scotland as a guarantee for an additional 50,000 florins. The following year, Christian could not raise the rest of the sum and pawned Shetland for the remaining 8,000 florins, the much smaller amount still a bone of contention among the Shetlanders. In 1472, Orkney and Shetland were officially annexed to the Scottish crown. There has been much discussion over why Christian agreed to the arrangement that led him to pawning Orkney and Shetland to Scotland. Writing in a 1969 edition of the Scottish Historical Review, Danish historian Kai Horby explains that in working with medieval foreign policy, the student is often into conjecture about motives of the various parties. But Horby speculates that Christian may have been seeking to gain favor on the continent with France or Burgundy. Ross writes that King Christian had given his daughter away to a splendid match, and the size of her dowry rang round Europe. He had a treaty of friendship with Scotland, a country strategically placed and growing in power. It's not clear whether Christian I actually intended to return Orkney and Shetland back to Norwegian rule. The islands had become less important to the kingdom by that point, but he did say so, saying in a proclamation that we intend to redeem your land very soon to the crown of Norway. It's not even clear whether he had authority to pawn the islands, as the councils of the realm of Norway and Denmark had not agreed. They compelled all of his successors to swear an oath upon their coronation that they would redeem the pledge. At least 2 times in history, the Scots have approached Norway with the intent of returning the islands in exchange for money that they could use to fight wars with England. And at least 6 different times, the Danish crown has approached the Scots, seeking to return the islands to Norwegian rule, but nothing ever happened. Despite the deal being completely open-ended, the islands remain part of Scotland, a deal that dwarfs anything that Rick has ever managed on Pawn Stars. And more recently, as recently as last July 2023, councils in Orkney and Shetland, feeling that they have been neglected by Scotland or the United Kingdom, have suggested that they should be returned to Norwegian rule, but no action on that seems imminent. Instead, the most northerly parts of the United Kingdom continue to maintain a Norse heritage that sets them apart. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.